Dumako tayo ngayon sa lesson 10 ng ating module na may pamagat na Japanese occupation. Ang Commonwealth of the Philippines na nooy nasa ilalim ng pangangalaga at proteksyon ng Estados Unidos ay hindi nakatakas sa bagsik ng mga Hapones na nagnais magkaroon ng dominasyon sa Asia. Bukod sa China ay nagtangkad din ng mga Hapones na sakupin ang iba't iba pang mga bansa sa Timog Silangang Asya at maging ang Australia. Sa pagnanais nila na marating ang mga karatig bansa ng Pilipinas gaya ng Malaysia at Indonesia maging ang Australia, ay kinakailangan nilang dumaan dito sa Pilipinas. Kung kaya't sinasabi na ito ay isa sa mga pangunahing dahilan kung bakit nila tayo sinakop. Bukod pa riyan sa katotohanan na ang Pilipinas ay nasa ilalim noon ng kapangyarihan ng mga Amerikano na naging kaaway naman ng mga Hapones sa panahon ng digmaan. Ang dahilan kung bakit naisakupin ng mga Hapon ang mga karatig bansa sa Timog Silangang Asya katulad ng Malaysia at Indonesia ay dahil sa ang mga teritoryong ito ay kakakitaan ng limpak-limpak ng mga natural resources. It so happen kasi ng Japan ay hindi gaanong nabiyayaan ng mga natural resources kung kaya't kinakailangan niyang sakupin ang ibang bansa upang magkaroon ng mga resources. Sa pagsapit ng December 8, 1941, ay sinugod ng mga Hapon ang iba't ibang mga lugar sa Pilipinas katulad ng Davao, Tuguegarao, Zambales, Tarlac at Pampanga. Ito yung nagsilbing senyal sa napipintong pananakop ng mga Hapon sa Pilipinas na nagtagal mula noong 1942 hanggang 1945. Gayong maiksi lamang ang pananakop ng mga Hapon sa Pilipinas, hindi naman ma-imagine yung destruction na naitulot na nasabing pananakop. In human lives na nawala, maging sa destruction of properties. Ito ang mga magsisabibilang learning objectives natin sa lesson na ito. Ang una, to examine the events which happened in the Philippines during the Japanese occupation. And ang ikalawa ay to value the heroism of the Filipinos who sacrifice their lives for freedom. May iba't ibang mga dahilan kung bakit nais sakupin ng mga Hapon ng Pilipinas. Ngunit, ang magandang katanungan ay, alam ba ng pamahalaang Commonwealth na nagnanais ang mga Hapon na sakupin ng Pilipinas? Ito ay isang magandang katanungan dahil sa ang ilan sa mga literatura ng nasabing kapanahunan ay nagsasabi na hindi tinitingnan ni Manuel Quezon ang Hapon bilang isang banta. Sa katunayan, sa isang artikulo na na-publish sa Philippine Magazine noong July 20, 1938, Quezon denied the existence of any illegitimate Japanese designs toward the Philippines. Ngunit ang ganitong klase ng dismissal of Japanese threat ay nagbago nang sumapi ang Japan sa Axis powers. Ilang buwan bago magkaroon ng digmaan ay klaro na para sa pamahalaang Commonwealth na mayroong magaganap na digmaan. Siguro ang hindi lang nila alam ay kung kailan. Ito yung dahilan kung bakit kinuha nila si Douglas MacArthur bilang defense advisor ng pamahalaang Commonwealth. Noong December 8, 1941 ay binomba ng mga Hapon ang Davao, Tuguegarao, Zambales, Tarlac at Pampanga. Katulad na nangyari sa Pearl Harbor sa Hawaii, ay na-surprise itong mga Pilipino at mga Amerikanong sundalo because they were caught unattended. They were not expecting that the Japanese would attack. Ito yung dahilan kung bakit marami sa mga military assets ng mga Pilipino at mga Amerikano ang nawasak because of that surprise bombing attack. Hinihintay na nila because of the loss of these military assets. They were expecting that anytime the Japanese would come, the Japanese invading forces would come. That is why the government declared the city of Manila as an open city noong December 26, 1941. The reason for that is para maiwasan yung further destruction ng nasabing lungsod. However, some of the buildings were still hit during the initial encounter with the Japanese. Ang ilan sa mga napuruhang mga buildings ay matatagpuan sa Intramuros area. While the Japanese were nearing the capital, Quezon and his family members, as well as other government officials, transferred to Corregidor. Kasama dito, kasama dito yung ilan sa kanyang mga cabinet secretaries. Pero hindi lahat ay isinama dahil sa gusto ni Quezon na mayroong may iwan dito sa Maynila para sila yung magsisilbi bilang contact ng mga Japanese should they come to the Philippines. So sino-sino ito? Diyan papasok sa nila George Vargas pati si Jose P. Laurel. The Japanese eventually entered Manila and the city fell to the hands of the invading forces. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa announced on January 3, 1942, the end of American rule in the Philippines and declared a martial law or martial rule under the Japanese. He stated that it was the intention of the Japanese to emancipate the Filipinos from the yoke of American colonialism, and the Philippines shall be part of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, believing that Asia should be for Asians and not for Westerners. The Japanese simultaneously occupied various parts of the Philippines to the point that Filipino and American defenders were forced to retreat in Bataan and Corregidor. In order to save Quezon, his family members, and other high-ranking officials from the threat of being captured by the Japanese, they were evacuated from Corregidor on February 20, 1942, on board a submarine bound for Australia. They were then transferred to the United States, where they established a government in exile. General Douglas MacArthur also left the Philippines in compliance to President Roosevelt's order, thus leaving behind the promise that he shall return. MacArthur was succeeded by General Jonathan Wainwright, who was tasked to lead the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, or the USAFE. On their effort to save the Philippines from the Japanese, Filipino and American soldiers fought valiantly. However, the forces defending Bataan were defeated on April 9, 1942. As they surrendered, 36,000 soldiers were forced to take the death march from Mariveles, Bataan up to the Manila Railroad Station in San Fernando, Pampanga, wherein box carriages were prepared to transport them to Camp O'Donnell in Capas, Tarlac. Filipino and American prisoners of war suffered unimaginable horrors during this so-called death march, as many of them died from hunger, exhaustion, and abuses made by the Japanese. Corregidor, which had been the last stronghold of the USAFE, soon fell to the hands of the Japanese invaders on May 6, 1942. General Wainwright surrendered to Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa. The Philippine Executive Commission. The Philippine Executive Commission, or PEC, was formed on January 23, 1942, with George Vargas as its first chairperson. It is comprised of 6 commissions, all led by Filipinos. Commission on Justice, led by Jose P. Laurel. Commission on Education and Health, led by Claro M. Recto. Commission on Interior, led by Benigno Aquino Sr., Commission on Finance, led by Antonio de las Alas, Commission on Agriculture and Commerce, led by Rafael Alunan, and Commission on Public Works and Communication, led by Quintin Paredes. Being a Japanese-sponsored government, each of the commission had a Japanese advisor. On the other hand, Jose Yulo was appointed as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Originally, the PEC was designed to be the caretaker government of the greater city of Manila. However, its power and authority soon spread throughout the Philippines. The Japanese tried to eradicate all traces of American influence in the country. Efforts like changing street names and other infrastructures bearing American names were made. Other than that, Nippongo was taught in schools, and the use of the national language was preferred rather than using English as the primary mode of instruction. Other than that, Japanese songs were played in radios to introduce to the Filipinos the Japanese culture. However, The Japanese brutality made their propaganda efforts futile in winning the trust and affection of the Filipinos who remained to be loyal to the Americans. The 1943 Constitution. The then Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Toho himself promised to give the Philippines its independence. In compliance to this, the Preparatory Commission for Philippine Independence, or the PCPI, was established with Jose P. Laurel as its president. The commission was tasked to oversee all matters pertaining to the drafting of the Constitution. On the other hand, the Philippine Executive Commission established the Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas, or the Kalibapi. It acted as the sole political party in the Philippines. The members of the Kalibapi were the ones who ratified the Constitution prepared by the PCPI on September 4, 1943. Under the 1943 Constitution, the government had three branches: the executive, legislative, and judiciary. The executive branch shall be under the President of the Philippines. The legislative branch shall be constituted by a National Assembly and had the power to enact laws. The judicial branch, on the other hand, shall be under the Supreme Court. The Constitution also stipulated that Filipino shall be the national language of the Republic. Soon after, Jose P. Laurel was elected President of the Philippines, while Benigno Aquino Sr. as Speaker of the National Assembly. On October 14, 1943, the Japanese declared the independence of the Philippines and inaugurated the Second Philippine Republic. However, not so many countries recognized the birth of the Second Republic. Resistance to the Japanese. The Filipinos continued to fight the Japanese. Various guerrilla units were formed, the most famous of which include the Markings guerrillas, the Hunters ROTC, and the Hooks, or the Hukbong Bayan Laban sa Hapon. Although these guerrillas belong to different ideologies, the Hooks being the military arm of the Partido Comunista, they had a common enemy during the time, and those were the Japanese. Japan's attack to the Philippines came by surprise. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese armed forces launched simultaneous attacks on two major airfields in Luzon, the Clark Air Base in Pampanga and the Nichols Field in the outskirts of Manila on the following day. Also, on December 8th, the Japanese forces landed in Bataan Island. After crippling the air defenses of the country, the Japanese soon launched an invasion forces at the Lingayen Gulf on December 22, 1941. By January 2, 1942, they had already occupied Manila, which was then declared as an open city to save it from eventual destruction. While MacArthur and his troops retreated to Bataan, Quezon, along with other Commonwealth officials, went to Corregidor, then eventually to the United States. With top military and civil government officials leaving the country, organized resistance of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East soon ended, and by April 9, 1942, nearly 76,000 Filipino and American soldiers surrendered to the Japanese. The absence of an organized resistance did not deter the Filipinos from fighting the Japanese. Although lots of people sacrificed their lives in defending the country from the Japanese, there were those whose names were left unsung, while some were publicly recognized as war heroes. Also, resistance against the invaders was not a monopoly of men, as some women also fought. The following are some of them. Felipa Kulala and the Hukbalahap. Contrary to the popular notion that Hukbalahap existed immediately upon the Japanese invasion, records coming from the Huk leadership itself tells that the organization was formally established on March 29, 1942. But what's special with this is the event which preceded the organization's foundation, wherein a Filipina played an important role. Felipa Kulala, a member of the Kalipunang Pambansa ng mga Magsasaka sa Pilipinas or KPMP, also known as Dayang-Dayang, was a guerrilla leader who, with the assistance of Lope de la Rosa, organized a guerrilla detachment in Pampanga. Her detachment's initial victory was an attack of a Japanese detachment in Candaba, Pampanga on March 8, 1942. Realizing that the Japanese were not quite invincible, the group ambushed occupation troops on March 13, 1942, wherein they were able to kill around 30 to 40 Japanese soldiers along with other 63 Filipino officers who collaborated with the Japanese. Eventually, the Hukbalahap was formed by the Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas. Kulala and about 100 of her men enlisted. This initial victory in Pampanga catapulted Kulala's popularity, thus enabling her to rise in the ranks of the communist guerrilla organization. As a matter of fact, she was elected along with Castro Alejandrino, Bernardo Poblete, and Luis Taruc as members of the military committee of the Hukbalahap. However, this popularity and favor from the Huks was short-lived, for in the following year, she was executed due to allegations of using her rank to accumulate wealth and a variety of other abuses. The Unsung Angels of Bataan. When the war broke out, everyone was caught by surprise, including the nurses serving the armed forces. By December 24, 1941, the first batch of 25 American and 25 Filipino nurses evacuated to the fishing village of Limay in Bataan. Another 50 nurses departed over the Christmas week, while those who were not able to evacuate surrendered to the Japanese on January 2, 1942. It was recorded that there were 31 nurses who evacuated with the American nurses in Bataan. In Bataan, the nurses, both Americans and Filipinos, were exposed to the harsh realities of war. Some of the facilities where they were stationed were makeshift converted barracks and carabao stalls, tending some 500 to 1,000 patients. It was described that some of the injured personnel lay in a double and triple deck bamboo bunks, some with kulambo or mosquito netting. Surgical operations were also conducted on some of these makeshift facilities, along with some spaces allocated as eye, ear, nose and throat, orthopedic, general surgical, gas gangrene, and prison wards. Apart from the threat imposed by the invading enemies, the environment itself proved to be somewhat of a hazard. Jungles were bulldozed to pave the way of creating another facility to accommodate the increasing number of patients. It was described that carabaos, wild pigs, monkeys, and snakes wandered into the wards. Battlefield nursing is one of the most difficult situations, as you can imagine the chaos. The nurses administered morphine to the patients, regularly cleaned and dressed their combat wounds, tending and washing them, and observing if there are any signs of gangrene among them. Hunger was a different matter, for the 180-day stockpile of food supplies soon ran out and were not enough to feed nearly 26,000 refugees and 35,000 troops. Supplies of rice, tomatoes, canned corned beef, and salmon ran out that they were forced to eat carabaos, wild pigs, monkeys, and even horse meat. Based from the retrieved document highlighting some excerpts from a letter from Josephine Nesbit, captain from the Army Nurse Corps, formerly chief nurse and assistant chief nurse on Bataan and Corregidor, and one of the army nurses liberated from UST, the deeds of the Filipino nurses during the war were highly regarded by their American counterparts. Captain Nesbit mentioned that while the American nurses were interned in UST, these Filipino nurses continued sending toiletries, money, and fruits whenever they had the opportunity to do so. She also mentioned that as soon as they were liberated, these Filipino nurses were there to rejoice with them. Valeria Yay Panlilio. Prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, Yay gained popularity while working as a journalist/broadcaster for the Philippines Herald and the KZRH radio station. Her excellence was at par to the point that the Fortune magazine staff writer Florence Horn described her probably the best-known woman in the islands. One account states that while recovering from malaria on a property of a kind farmer sometime in 1942, she encountered a large group of guerrillas sleeping on the farmer's property. Fearing for their own lives, Yay told the guerrillas to leave the property, but none of them moved, stating that they will only heed to the orders of their major. The major referred here was Marcos Villa Agustin, also known as Marking, who organized the Marking's guerrilla. Prior to the outbreak of the war, Marking worked as a boxer and a bus driver. When the Japs attacked, he worked for the Philippine Army transporting soldiers to Bataan. The convoy was cut off and Marking was arrested by the Japanese. Fortunately, he managed to escape. He then gathered some Filipinos to join him in forming a guerrilla group. The brief encounter of Yay and Marking soon ended to romance as they became a couple during the war. It was mentioned that Yay became second in command of their guerrilla unit, wherein she used her intelligence, thus gaining the moniker the brains of Marking's guerrilla. She joined her men as they hid in the jungles of Sierra Madre, survived hunger, paranoia, and near-death encounters with the enemies. They were successful in harassing the Japanese troops until the liberation of the Philippines by General MacArthur. She then became a United States Medal of Freedom with Silver Palm recipient. Maria Orosa. Recently, a grave marker with the name of Maria Orosa was found at the Malate Catholic School, the premises of which served as the wartime Remedios Hospital. Although no remains were found, information about Maria Orosa soon flooded various social media platforms. Maria Orosa was a former director of the Bureau of Plant Industry. Among her main contributions were the invention of banana ketchup and soyalac, the development of darak or rice bran to combat thiamine deficiency among the children, and the compilation of over 700 recipes, all of which were helpful in fighting malnutrition, which was quite widespread during her time. With the outbreak of the Second World War, she continued working in the Bureau of Plant Industry. Serving as a guerrilla captain in the Marking's guerrilla unit, they were able to slip soyalac to some internment camps by hiding it inside bamboo posts. These posts were carried inside the camps by guerrillas disguising as carpenters. During the last days of the Japanese occupation, Manila was blanketed by barrages of American artillery fire. Orosa was hit by a shrapnel on her foot but refused to be evacuated. She was brought to the Remedios Hospital by her assistant Luis del Rosario, but unfortunately, it was there that she was hit for the second time by a shrapnel from an American artillery fire. Josefa Llanes Escoda. Josefa Llanes Escoda was well known as the founder of the Girl Scouts of the Philippines. Operations of the Girl Scouts of the Philippines were suspended after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but Josefa busied herself in continuing the operation of the National Federation of Women's Clubs, or the NFWC. During that time, many students from various schools and universities in Manila were stranded with no money and means of living. With a deep sense of compassion among these students, she offered the upper floor of the NFWC office to serve as their dormitory. To keep the boarders busy, Josefa set up a carinderia or a coffee shop which later proved to be useful for the guerrilla contacts. In an article of Oscar Pilagman Jr., published by the Philippine Daily Inquirer last September 20, 2018, he narrated that following the fall of Bataan, Josefa and her husband Antonio joined a group of doctors living for San Fernando. They came back with lists of names of prisoners, addresses of relatives, and notes. PEPA mobilized the National Federation of Women's Clubs staff to make the connections between the prisoners of war and their families in Manila. Thus began the work of the Women of the Philippines for National Defense, connecting families of the prisoners of war, passing food, clothing, money, messages, and information useful to the resistance movement. Pepa and Antonio even opened a coffee shop on the road leading to the prison in Cabanatuan, where hundreds of American soldiers were held, so they could gather information from the conversations of Japanese soldiers taking their break in the shop. After gaining the trust of the Japanese, they were given passes to supply rice and other foodstuffs to the prisoners in the camp. Sacks of supplies served as caches of secret messages exchanged between the prisoners and their families. Information in these activities made the Kempeitai suspicious. On June 9, 1940, Antonio Escoda and General Vicente Lim were captured by the Japanese. Sensing her own capture imminent, Pepa left this message to someone. If you survive, tell the people that the women of the Philippines did their part in making the ember sparks of truth and liberty alive till the last moment. She was arrested by the Kempeitai on August 27, 1944, wherein she was brought to Fort Santiago. General Lim and Antonio Escoda were court-martialed on November 24, 1944, and were sentenced to death due to allegation of treason. However, information on the fate of Josefa was quite vague. No one knows where her mortal remains lay, although some speculate that she was executed at the Chinese cemetery sometime in February 1945. Liberation from Japanese occupation. The American victory in the Battle of Midway on June 2 to 6, 1942 signaled the start of the end of Japanese domination in the Pacific. However, it was only in 1944 that the Americans pushed through the liberation of various territories led by the Japanese. On August 9, 1944, the Americans bombed Davao. While on September 21, 1944, an air raid decimated Japanese air assets in Manila. On October 20, 1944, MacArthur, along with President Osmeña, Quezon had already died in the United States due to tuberculosis, landed in Leyte, and signaled the start of the liberation of the Philippines. The succeeding Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 23 to 26, 1944, considered to be the largest naval battle in history, obliterated the Japanese naval forces. Thus, it was clear that Japan would soon lose war. Desperation among the Japanese soldiers led them to conduct kamikaze or suicide missions. It was estimated that there were about 424 kamikaze warriors who sacrificed their lives. From Leyte, 800 American war vessels docked at Lingayen Gulf and started the campaign to liberate Manila. The Americans reached the northern part of Manila on February 3, 1944, and was able to liberate around 4,000 prisoners of war incarcerated at the University of Santo Tomas. The ensuing Battle of Manila saw the destruction of the city, wherein Japanese stubbornly defended their positions, while Americans mercilessly bombed Manila, which they initially declared an open city. As the fighting continued, buildings and houses were burned, while civilians were massacred by the Japanese. It was estimated that more than 100,000 Filipinos were either killed or wounded. When Manila was completely liberated after a month of fighting, the Americans and their Filipino counterparts endeavored to liberate other parts of the Philippines. It was only on July 4, 1945 that MacArthur declared that the Philippines is liberated from the Japanese occupation. The dropping of 2 atomic bombs to the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and August 9, 1945 respectively, weakened the morale of the Japanese, eventually paving the way to their surrender to the Allied forces on August 15, 1945. The surrender was made aboard the USS Missouri off the shore of Tokyo Bay. With the Japanese surrender, the Second Philippine Republic, headed by Jose P. Laurel, was disbanded on August 17, 1945. Re-establishment of the Commonwealth Government. While President Osmeña, along with other government officials, landed once again on Philippine shores in October 20, 1944, it was only on the 23rd day of October that the Commonwealth of the Philippines was once again established. When the Japanese were driven out of Manila, the seat of government was transferred back to its former capital. On July 9, 1945, the Congress of the Philippines was convened. Manuel Rojas was elected as Senate President, while Jose Zulueta was elected as Speaker of the House of Representatives. Among the challenges faced by the re-established Commonwealth government was how to handle the economic difficulties posed by the recent war. Apart from that, another thing which needs to be settled was the collaboration issue. While the Americans wanted to punish the collaborators, Osmeña was hesitant. He insisted that those who worked for the Japanese were not traitors but were fulfilling the duty tasked to them by Quezon when he left the Philippines. The reason for this was because Quezon feared that the Japanese would install Artemio Ricarte. While top officials in the United States recommended the execution of the collaborators, MacArthur decided to exile them instead in Hiwahig in Palawan. On the other hand, the People's Court was established and aimed to try those who collaborated with the Japanese. The first one to be tried by this court was Teofilo M. Sison, who served as Secretary of National Defense before the war. He was found guilty and was handed down a life imprisonment sentence. Other than that, rehabilitating the country was an enormous challenge to the Commonwealth government. The United States, through the Philippine Rehabilitation Act of 1946, established the Philippine War Damage Commission, which was tasked to make compensation for the physical loss or destruction or of damage to property in the Philippines occurred after December 7, 1941 and before October 1, 1945. $400 million was appropriated for the purpose of paying compensation to war damage claims, while $120 million was allocated for the repair of public roads, port and harbor facilities, public properties, and others. Other than that, the Americans left their military surplus amounting to around $100 million for the disposal of the Philippine government. In total, the Philippine Rehabilitation Act allocated $620 million of rehabilitation money.